Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She had also worked on conservation projects like Kalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as a director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for Bachelors of Architecture. The subject we are discussing is Human Settlements Planning. The topic we'll further delve into is issues in contemporary urban planning in India. In this lecture, we will discuss globalization and its impact on cities. We'll start with globalization. Globalization is a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies and governments of different nations, a process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. International Monetary Fund (IMF) identified 4 basic aspects of globalization: trade and transactions, capital and investment movements, migration and movement of people, dissemination of knowledge. Globalization is the new buzzword that has come to dominate the world since the 90s of the last century with the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. The term implies worldly integration or amalgamation of various cultures, styles, economic policies, ideas, etc. It must not be confused with making things common around the world. This is an integration, not a simulation. Globalization is a consequence of increased trade across nations. Anthony Giddens, 1990, describes globalization as the intensifications of worldwide social relations which link distinct localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring miles away. Globalization is affected as well as affects these following factors: culture, society, politics, economy and the environment. So, they are both the cause as well as effects of globalization. Globalization refers to rapid increase in the share of economic activity taking place across national borders. It goes beyond the international trade, includes the way in which goods or services are being produced or created, delivered and sold, as well as movement of capital. Why is it referred to as globalization? Increasing dominance of the so-called world cities of New York, Tokyo, London, and the impact on the spatial planning system, especially with respect to increasing demand for suitable services and infrastructure and the formation of a new social structure within global cities. The advancements in transportation, communication and technology have had a profound effect on the geographic distance and connectivity at a new level of human interaction. We will look into the history of globalization. Globalization, even though the term is new, the process is definitely not new. For thousands of years, people as well as later corporations have been buying from and selling to each other in the lands of greatest distances, such as through the famous Silk Route across Central Asia that connected China and Europe during the Middle Ages. Likewise, for centuries, people and corporations have invested in enterprises in other countries. In fact, many of the features of the current wave of globalization are similar to those prevailing before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. Thomas L. Friedman divides the history of globalization into 3 periods: The first phase occurred between 1492 and 1800. This was globalization of countries. The second phase occurred between 1800 to the year 2000, globalization of companies. And the third phase of globalization, the beginning of millennium, that is 2000 to the present, is globalization of individuals. An early form of globalized economics and culture known as archaic globalization existed during the Hellenistic age. All of this comes under the first phase of globalization, when commercialized urban centers were focused around the axis of Greek culture over a wide range that stretched from India to Spain, with such cities such as Alexandria, Athens and Antioch as its center. Trade was widespread during that period, and it is the first time that the idea of a cosmopolitan culture emerged. The Islamic Golden Age was also an important early stage of globalization, when Jewish and Muslim traders and explorers established a sustained economy across the old world, resulting in a globalization of crops, trade, knowledge and technology. Globally significant crops such as sugar and cotton became widely cultivated across the Muslim world in this period, while the necessity of learning Arabic and completing the Hajj created a cosmopolitan culture. So, globalization was representative of both culture as well as trade. In the years since the Second World War, many governments have adopted free market economic systems, vastly increasing their own productive potential and creating new opportunities for international trade and investment. Governments also have negotiated dramatic reductions in barriers to commerce and have established international agreements to promote trade in goods, services and investment. Taking advantage of new opportunities in foreign markets, corporations have built foreign factories and established production and marketing arrangements with foreign partners. A defining feature of globalization, therefore, is an international industrial and financial business structure. So, it is both manufacturing, service sector, that is an international background. The economics and culture are also a part of this structure. So, what are the different threats and opportunities? Globalization can be forced for good. It has the potential to generate wealth and improve living standards, but it is currently not doing that very well at the moment. The benefits from increased trade, investment and technological innovation are not fairly distributed. The experience of the international trade union movement suggests that the reality for majority of the world's population is that things are getting worse. Poorer people are getting poorer and the richer people are packing their pockets further. Globalization as we know it is increasing the gap between the rich and the poor. This is because the policies that drive the globalization process are largely focused on the needs of business. The key players, the main stakeholders are multinational firms which carry out business across national borders, the World Trade Organization or the WTO, through which international trade agreements are negotiated and enforced, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, are means to assist government in achieving development aims through the provision of loans, technical assistance. Stages in globalization. The first step you have is domestic companies link with the dealer and the distributor. Then the company does the activities on its own. Company then begins to carry out its own manufacturing, marketing and sales in the foreign markets. Then company starts full-fledged operations including business systems and R&D. At this stage, the managers are expected to perform the tasks which they were doing in domestic markets to replicate them in foreign markets. The main causes or reasons for globalization. Firms operate internationally for a number of reasons. They may be seeking to secure better sources of raw materials and energy. They may want to obtain access to low cost factors of production such as labor. They may be attracted to certain countries because of subsidies those countries provide. They may be seeking new markets for their products. Domestic markets may no longer be able to absorb production at minimum efficiency scale. They may be motivated by lifestyle factors. Domestic markets become saturated. As they mature, firms look abroad for newer and better opportunities. They also may be seeking opportunities for better economies of scope and for learning. Now, we will discuss the pros and cons of globalization. The negative side, the proponents of global free trade say that it promotes global economic growth, creates jobs, makes companies more competitive and lowers prices for consumers. It also provides poor countries through infusions of foreign capital and technology with the chance to develop economically, and by spreading prosperity, creating the conditions in which democracy and respect for human rights may flourish. According to libertarians, globalizations will help us to raise the global economy only when the involved power blocks have mutual trust and respect for each other's opinion. Globalization and democracy should go hand in hand. It should be pure business with no colonistic designs. That is, you should not want to invade another country or take advantage of another country. Now, there is a worldwide market for companies and consumers to access products from different countries. There is a world power that is being created gradually instead of compartmentalized power sectors. Politics are merging and decisions that are being made are actually beneficial for people all over the world. Anti-globalists also claim that globalization is not working for the majority of the world. During the most recent period of rapid growth in global trade and investment, that is from 1960 to the year 1998, inequality has worsened both internationally and within individual countries. The UN Development Programme reports that the richest 20% of the world's population consume 86% of the world's resources, while the poorest 80% consume a meager 14%. So, there is not only a poorer getting poor and a richer getting rich adage, but also the resources available to the rich versus the poor is increasing besides just marginally. Some experts think that globalization is also leading to the incursion of communicable diseases. Deadly diseases like HIV and AIDS are being spread by travelers to the remotest corners of the globe. Globalization has led to the exploitation of labor. Prisoners and child workers are used to work in inhuman conditions. Safety standards are being ignored to produce cheaper goods. There is also an increase in human trafficking, and that is the beginning of outsourcing jobs. Because labor is expensive in America, they are outsourced to countries like India, China and Indonesia, where they pretty much run sweatshops, where labor is cheaper, they are paid in cents for a couple of hours of work, and they are treated very badly and made to work in inhuman conditions. And because people want a better life, they actually get trapped in the human trafficking trade. They want to move on to a better country, but instead they are stuck doing slave-like work in between. Social welfare schemes or safety nets are under great pressure because of this, in especially developed countries, because of the deficits and other economic ramifications of globalization. Now, looking on to the positive side of it, globalization not only promotes the economy of the world, but also individual countries which are impacted by this process or phenomenon. It not only affects the developed countries, but also influences and stimulates the growth in developing countries as well as third world nations. So, now besides the global economy, it really plays well into the hands of transferring knowledge, education and culture. So, culture in the form of music, dance, arts and crafts to a new level, because you are exposed to new forms which helps people all over the world understand and appreciate culture across the globe and removes the blinders that exist in most people. Now, there is also a worldwide market for companies and consumers to access products from different countries. There is a world power that is being created gradually instead of compartmentalized power sectors. Politics are merging and decisions that are being made are actually beneficial for people all over the world. So what actually happens is when we see politics playing an important role in another country, as the globalization process is increased, we are aware of what is happening in all other countries and the mistakes that another country's planners make or economists make, we are aware of them and we are actually given a chance to learn from them. The we could be the third world nations, developing countries, anybody. So it is our chance to now learn from the developed countries and the mistakes that they do make. There is more of an influx of information between two countries. There is a cultural intermingling. Each country is learning more about other cultures and other countries. Since we share financial interests, corporations and governments are trying to sort out ecological problems for each other. No more is it looking at air pollution, soil pollution, noise pollution as an individualized problem. These are considered more global problems like global warming, all of that. Even though it could affect one particular country more than the other, they do realize that it is something that is happening entirely across the globe, and researchers across the globe help particular countries that are being affected more by this process. Socially, we have become more open and tolerant towards each other, and people who live in other parts of the world are not considered aliens. So that's one of the important things that has gradually changing. You can't say it's obviously changed even now, because even now the acceptance of a foreigner in other than majorly cosmopolitan cities across the globe is still frowned upon or looked upon. So now, but even then we have become more tolerant. Now if you have Indians living in all sorts of countries across the globe, you have similarly other kinds of foreigners living over here for different reasons, let it be education, health, or even economics or work. So whatever the reason, now traveling to another country is no more an alien prospect. It is actually looked forward for, it's something that everyone looks forward towards. Most people see speedy travel, mass communications and quick dissemination of information through the internet as benefits of globalization. Now we will move on to the general impacts. Cities now compete with one another on a global scale to attract financial investment and well-educated mobile workforces. They have become centers for socio-economic development as well as sites for promoting global commerce. The impact of globalization on urban planning is also related to the change in the realm of politics. So now once a country is considered open to globalization, different cities want to compete to become the next globalized seat in that country. It could be the competition between Bangalore and Chennai, Hyderabad, Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta. They all want to attract investors in different ways by state policies and other such infrastructural development. So obviously it is related to the change in the realm of politics and depends who is on power at that point of time. Urbanization is one of the negative impacts of globalization and integration of economies. Globalization leads to urbanization. According to the United Nations Center for Human Settlements, there were only 4 cities in population over 100,000 in 1900s, and in 1961 there were 141 cities, and today the world's urban population is increasing at the rate of 1.3% per annum in the period of 1995 to 2000. So you can see the range it is changing in. There is increased economic investment and proliferation in infrastructure development. Projects are exerting enormous pressure on the existing resources and the capacity of cities to accommodate this unprecedented growth. Other detrimental consequences include poverty, housing shortage, inefficient and inequitable delivery of infrastructural services, economic inequality, social exclusion, and poor quality local environments. So all these impacts now we are looking at is felt not in a global level but as a more regional or a city level. Globalization has increased the disparities between the developed or the rich and the poor nations. The developing countries, for example, like the African countries, seem to be excluded from technologically advanced information-based economy of the world system. At the same time, there is also an increasing social and economic disparity within the urban areas and the developed countries. The high skilled workers are in a better position than before with the advent of high technology jobs, and there has not been a proportional increase for the low skilled workforce. So, what has happened with the growth of technology, growth of education is there has been the increase in the number of high education or high technology jobs, but in the service sector is gradually transitioning into a more machine sufficient or a more technologically sufficient infrastructure, where low skilled workforce is losing its importance and their daily wages that they could be getting is being replaced by a better person who is more educated or by a better system that has been brought from another country. In terms of spatial geography, there has also been a change in the patterns of industrial locations. There has been a change in the spatial division of labor and the techniques of production, where the different stages of production could be divided according to specific features and specializations of different regions and their workforce. The management of this system being administered with the help of telecommunications and the information technology industries. Now, the relationship between globalization and planning. The pressures on urban planning actually arise from global hierarchy of cities and the impact these cities have in a regional and local context. Economic globalization within the world cities of local employment sources has led to a transformation at the level of human interaction, has transformed into a new dimension never experienced before, with telecommunication and transportation being key players in stimulating this experience. The concept of globalization as means to represent the combination of these two forces, that is the pressure to integrate the global forces as well as the local pressures. The challenges faced by governments have become more complex, and apart from responding to the pressures of the domestic demands and their political legitimacy and their internal needs and self-interest, they also have to balance the pressures from super governmental of global political structures like the World Bank and the United Nations. So, now besides the government being functioning for itself, we have the super watchdogs like the World Bank and the United Nations who look upon every country. So, when you actually look at United Nations and World Bank, in other words, it is nothing but United States of America. With the process of globalization, instead of pockets of powers emerging, now one country has gone to the seat of the ultimate power, and they actually have the power to dictate to other developing or underdeveloped countries, see, this is what you are doing is wrong, this is what you are doing is right. So, we have to take it in the right way, in the sense the only way we know is the way they are telling us. So, number one, it could be wrong. Number two, it could be something that they have also done over a period of time that has not felt the repercussions like it is going to be felt in our part of the country. So, these challenges are definitely more complex, because now we have the government is not just taking decisions for its own country, and it is not only answerable to its very own people, but it is also answerable to a higher authority. Globalization also presents new avenues for planning practice and academia. The process of globalization requires planners to become more sensitive to the flexibility and the plethora of options offered by the globalization effect to develop solutions and mechanisms that are timely and rapid solutions. So, it is very important that we realize what are the new avenues are being presented by this process of globalization. For example, the increased use of geographic information system data and remote sensing data can actually facilitate the research and flow of information in both urban growth and development as well as in effective spatial planning. It will not only help in the urban scenario, but also in rural scenario. With GIS and RS data, remote sensing data, we can actually ensure where is it that precipitation is happening, what kind of river flow is there, what kind of water movement is there. Besides, based on that, irrigation plans may also be made. Newman and Thornley actually observed that in the global era, planning lies at the interface of market and politics. Globalization has its advantages and disadvantages, and from the perspective of planning profession, an increased flow of information internationally is one of the advantages that would be effective tools to facilitate two-way learning by comparison. So, it is very important to realize that yes, there are advantages and disadvantages, but from the perspective of planning, we have to see that how is it going to work in our benefit or in the way we want it to work for us. Now, how do we go about planning for globalization? It is essentially a process that involves the general following tasks: identifying the languages and locales that must be supported, designing features that support targeted markets, languages and the locations, writing codes that functions equally well in all of these locations. These tasks are all centered on the concept of locale and cultural awareness. Now, globalization of law. This may be defined as the worldwide progression of transnational legal structures and discourses along the dimensions of extensity, intensity, velocity and impact. Research demonstrates that globalization is variably contested in several domains of research on law. Number 1, the construction and regulation of global markets, crimes against humanity and genocide, the diffusion of political liberalism and constitutionalism, and finally, the institutionalization of women's rights. So, all of this has now become, instead of every country looking into it, all of these have become global aspects of law, like we were just discussing how the whole concept of global warming, climate responsive architecture, green architecture has all been taken at a global level in spite of the problems being faced by certain individual countries. Effectiveness, for how effective is this law going to be when it is for the entire country or the entire globe? The farther globalizing legal norms and practices are located from core local cultural institutions and beliefs. So, some of us are, and first of all, they are not reinforceable because you do not know what is the limitations of reinforcing this law. The less likely global norms will provoke explicit contestation and confrontation. Future research will be productively directed to where and how global law originates, and how and when global norms and law are transmitted and enforced, and how global local settlements are negotiated. So, now when you look at laws, there is obviously a global law, your comparison to the local law, and how is it that these settlements can be negotiated. How does globalization affect poverty? Competition among workers or foreign investments or trade or government borrowing. There is no single measure of integration into the world economy. Globalization has become a dominant factor in producing a new kind of poverty. When governments assume debt in a private capital market and declining world demand for their commodities decreases, the price is reduced and they seek funds from the IMF to repay these loans, and they agreed to the conditions for internal reform, and these conditions impose hardship on their people. It is tempting to conclude that therefore, globalization does cause poverty. Why some are actually against globalization? Globalization is used as an ideology by the powerful to deceive the people about illusionary benefits of dehumanizing system. In other words, it is actually a form of false consciousness that prevents people from seeing their true interests. It perpetuates the inequity and exploitation inherent in capitalism. Globalization polarizes the globe, that is, making the rich richer and poor poorer. It is not subject to democratic control and therefore cannot serve the interests of people. It is a capitalist economy that is the basis of globalization. So, you cannot expect it to be democratic. Due to the scale of change, it intensifies long-standing problems such as deterioration of the environment. So, it is kind of a vicious circle. Because of globalization, everyone in the world is aware of the problems of a certain country, but the very fact or the root cause of those problems is the factor that all the countries are now in such close relationship because of globalization. Globalization and cultural diversity. Multinational corporations actually promote a certain kind of consumerist culture in which standard commodities are promoted by global marketing campaigns, like you have the Coca-Cola and things like that. So, these create certain desires and certain lifestyles created by these desires. Backed by the power of certain states, Western ideals are falsely established as universal or overriding local traditions. So, this is termed as cultural imperialism. So, what the West is doing is right and what we are doing is wrong. Let us just blindly ape the West. Modern institutions have an inherently rationalizing thrust, making all human practices more efficient, controllable, like you have other commodifications like McDonald's, KFCs, the way those people are supposed to eat, let us the entire world eat like that. The United States exerts hegemonic influence in promoting the values and habits through popular culture and news media, which is nothing but Americanization. This actually helps them when they are going to outsource their labor. Their labor is going to be familiar with the nuances of living in America, working in America, eating in America, but except earning in America. They are going to know about everything about the country minus the spending standards or the standard of living in that country. So, positive parts of this, you have interaction across boundaries, you can learn from other cultures. So, you have a kind of pluralization that takes place. Similarly, cultural flows occurs in different spheres, and so we learn from other cultures, we can learn and we can also teach at the same time. So, once we become the teachers, we do get an upper hand. And then you have integration and spread of ideas and images which provoke reactions and resistance, that is contestation. Then you have global norms or practices which are interpreted differently according to local tradition, and the universal must take the particular forms. Diversity has itself become a global value promoted through international organization and movements, not to mention state-wise, nation-wise institutionalization. So, it is very important to realize that diversity not only has a global value, but it is being promoted on an international plus a national platform as well. So, the end of this, we have studied the globalization and its impact on cities across the world. At the end of this lecture, we should be able to answer the following questions. What is globalization? What are the 4 basic aspects of globalization? Discuss the history of globalization. Discuss the impacts of globalization. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you.